Book 6, Chapters 5 through 7 of On War, Volumes 2 and 3, by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by J. J. Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 5, Character of Strategic Defensive. We have already explained what the defensive is generally, namely, nothing more than a stronger form of carrying on war, by means of which we endeavour to wrest a victory, in order, after having gained a superiority, to pass over to the offensive, that is, to the positive object of war. Even if the intention of a war is only the maintenance of the existing situation of things, the status quo, still a mere parrying of a blow is something quite contradictory to the conception of the term war, because the conduct of war is unquestionably no mere state of endurance. If the defender has obtained an important advantage, then the defensive form has done its part, and under the protection of this success he must give back the blow, otherwise he exposes himself to certain destruction. Common sense points out that iron should be struck while it is hot, that we should use the advantage gained to guard against a second attack. How, when and where this reaction shall commence is subject certainly to a number of other conditions, which we can only explain hereafter. For the present we keep to this, that we must always consider this transition to an offensive return as a natural tendency of the defensive, therefore as an essential element of the same, and always conclude that there is something wrong in the management of a war when a victory gained through the defensive form is not turned to good account in any manner, but allowed to wither away. A swift and vigorous assumption of the offensive, the flashing sword of vengeance, is the most brilliant point in the defensive. He who does not at once think of it at the right moment, or rather he who does not from the first include this transition in his idea of the defensive, will never understand the superiority of the defensive as a form of war. He will be forever thinking only of the means which will be consumed by the enemy and gained by ourselves through the offensive, which means, however, depend not on tying the knot, but on untying it. Further, it is a stupid confusion of ideas if, under the term offensive, we always understand sudden attack or surprise, and consequently, under defensive, imagine nothing but embarrassment and confusion. It is true that a conqueror makes his determination to go to war sooner than the unconscious defender, and if he knows how to keep his measures properly secret, he may also, perhaps, take the defender unawares. But that is a thing quite foreign to war itself, for it should not be so. War actually takes place more for the defensive than for the conqueror, for invasion only calls forth resistance, and it is not until there is a resistance that there is war. A conqueror is always a lover of peace, as Bonaparte always asserted of himself. He would like to make his entry into our state unopposed. In order to prevent this, we must choose war, and therefore also make preparations. That is, in other words, it is just the weak, or that side which must defend itself, which should be always armed in order not to be taken by surprise. So it is willed by the art of war. The appearance of one side sooner than the other in the theatre of war depends besides, in most cases, on things quite different from a view of offensive or defensive. But although a view to one or the other of these forms is not the cause, it is often the result of this priority of appearance. Whoever is first ready will, on that account, go to work offensively, if the advantage of surprise is sufficiently great to make it expedient, and the party who is the last to be ready can only then in some measure compensate for this disadvantage which threatens him by the advantages of the defensive. At the same time, it must be looked upon in general as an advantage for the offensive that he can make that good use of being first in the field, which has been noticed in the third book. Only this general advantage is not an absolute necessity in every case. If, therefore, we imagine to ourselves a defensive, such as it should be, we must suppose it with every possible preparation of all means, with an army fit for and inured to war, with a general who does not wait for his adversary with anxiety, from an embarrassing feeling of uncertainty, but from his own free choice, with cool presence of mind, with fortresses who do not dread a siege, and lastly, with a loyal people who fear the enemy as little as he fears them. With such attributes, the defensive will act no such contemptible part in opposition to the offensive, and the latter will not appear such an easy and certain form of war as it does in the gloomy imaginations of those who can only see in the offensive courage, strength of will and energy, in the defensive helplessness and apathy. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. Extent of the means of defence. We have shown in the second and third chapters of this book how the defence has a natural advantage in the employment of those things which, irrespective of the absolute strength and qualities of the combatant forces, influence the tactical as well as the strategic result, namely the advantage of ground, sudden attack, attack from several directions (converging form of attack), the assistance of the theatre of war, support of the people, and the utilising great moral forces. We think it useful now to cast again a glance over the extent of the means which are at command of the defensive in particular, and which are to be regarded as the columns of the different orders of architecture in his edifice. 1. Landwehr, militia. This force has been used in modern times to combat the enemy on foreign soil, and it is not to be denied that its organisation in many states, for instance in Prussia, is of such a kind that it may almost be regarded as part of the standing army. Therefore it does not belong to the defensive exclusively. At the same time we must not overlook the fact that the very great use made of it in 1813, 14 and 15 was the result of defensive war, that it is organised in very few places to the same degree as in Prussia, and that always when its organisation falls below the level of complete efficiency, it is better suited for the defensive than for the offensive. But besides that, there always lies in the idea of a militia the notion of a very extensive, more or less voluntary co-operation of the whole mass of the people in support of the war, with all their physical powers, as well as with their feelings, and a ready sacrifice of all they possess. The more its organisation deviates from this, so much the more the force thus created will become a standing army under another name, and the more it will have the advantages of such a force. But it will also lose in proportion the advantages which belong properly to the militia, those of being a force, the limits of which are undefined, and capable of being easily increased by appealing to the feelings and patriotism of the people. In these things lies the essence of a militia. In its organisation latitude must be allowed for this co-operation of the whole people. If we seek to obtain something extraordinary from a militia, we are only following a shadow. But now the close relationship between this essence of a militia system and the conception of the defensive is not to be denied. Neither can it be denied that such a militia will always belong more to the defensive form than to the offensive, and that it will manifest chiefly in the defensive those effects through which it surpasses the attack. 2. Fortresses. The assistance afforded by fortresses to the offensive does not extend beyond what is given by those close upon the frontiers, and is only feeble in influence. The assistance which the defensive can derive from this reaches further into the heart of the country, and therefore more of them can be brought into use, and their utility differs in the degree of its intensity. A fortress which is made the object of a regular siege and holds out is naturally of more considerable weight in the scale of war than one which, by the strength of its works, merely forbids the idea of its capture, and therefore neither occupies nor consumes any of the enemy's forces. 3. The people. Although the influence of a single inhabitant of the theatre of war on the course of the war in most cases is not more perceptible than the co-operation of a drop of water in a whole river, still, even in cases where there is no such thing as a general rising of the people, the total influence of the inhabitants of a country in war is anything but imperceptible. Everything goes on easier in our own country, provided it is not opposed by the general feeling of the population. All contributions, great and small, are only yielded to the enemy under the compulsion of direct force. That operation must be undertaken by the troops, and cost the employment of many men as well as great exertions. The defensive receives all he wants, if not always voluntarily, as in cases of enthusiastic devotion, still through the long used channels of submission to the state on the part of the citizens, which has become second nature, and which, besides that, is enforced by the terrors of the law, with which the army has nothing to do. But the spontaneous co-operation of the people proceeding from true attachment is in all cases most important, as it never fails in all those points where service can be rendered without any sacrifice. We shall only notice one point which is of the highest importance in war, that is, intelligence, not so much special, great and important information through persons employed, as that respecting the innumerable little matters in connection with which the daily service of an army is carried on in uncertainty, and with regard to which a good understanding with the inhabitants gives the defensive a general advantage. If we ascend from this quite general and never failing beneficial influence up to special cases in which the populace begins to take part in the war, and then further up to the highest degree, whereas in Spain the war as regards its leading events is chiefly a war carried on by the people themselves, we may see that we have here virtually a new power rather than a manifestation of increased co-operation on the part of the people, and therefore that for the national armament or general call to arms may be considered as a particular means of defence. 5. Allies. Finally, we may further reckon allies as the last support of the defensive. Naturally, we do not mean ordinary allies, which the assailant may likewise have. We speak of those essentially interested in maintaining the integrity of the country. If, for instance, we look at the various states composing Europe at the present time, we find (open bracket), without speaking of a systematically regulated balance of power and interests, as that does not exist and therefore is often with justice disputed, still unquestionably (close bracket), that the great and small states and interests of nations are interwoven with each other in a most diversified and changeable manner. Each of these points of intersection forms a binding knot, for in it the direction of the one gives equilibrium to the direction of the other. By all these knots, therefore, evidently a more or less compact connection of the whole will be formed, and this general connection must be partially overturned by every change. In this manner the whole relations of all states to each other serve rather to preserve the stability of the whole than to produce changes, that is to say, this tendency to stability exists in general. This we conceive to be the true notion of a balance of power, and in this sense it will always of itself come into existence wherever there are extensive connections between civilised states. How far this tendency of the general interests to the maintenance of the existing state of things is efficient is another question. At all events, we can conceive some changes in the relations of single states to each other which promote this efficiency of the whole, and others which obstruct it. In the first case, they are efforts to perfect the political balance, and as these have the same tendency as the universal interests, they will also be supported by the majority of these interests. But in the other case they are of an abnormal nature, undue activity on the part of some single states, real maladies. Still, that these should make their appearance in a whole with so little cohesion as an assemblage of great and little states is not to be wondered at, for we see the same in that marvellously organised whole, the natural world. If in answer we are reminded of instances in history where single states have effected important changes solely for their own benefit, without any effort on the part of the whole to prevent the same, or cases where a single state has been able to raise itself so much above the others as to become almost the arbiter of the whole, then our answer is that these examples by no means prove that a tendency of the interests of the whole in favour of stability does not exist. They only show that its action was not powerful enough at the moment. The effort towards an object is a different thing from the motion towards it. At the same time it is anything but a nullity, of which we have the best exemplification in the dynamics of the heavens. We say the tendency of equilibrium is to the maintenance of the existing state, whereby we certainly assume that rest, that is equilibrium, existed in this state, for where that has already been disturbed, tension has already commenced, and there the equilibrium may certainly also tend to a change. But if we look to the nature of the thing, this change can only affect some few separate states, never the majority, and therefore it is certain that the preservation of the latter is supported and secured through the collective interests of the whole, certainly also that each single state which has not against it a tension of the whole will have more interest in favour of its defence than opposition to it. Whoever laughs at these reflections as utopian dreams does so at the expense of philosophical truth. Although we may learn from it the relations which the essential elements of things bear to each other, it would be rash to attempt to deduce laws from the same by which each individual case should be governed without regard to any accidental disturbing influences. But when a person, in the words of a great writer, never rises above anecdote, builds all history on it, begins always with the most individual points, with the climaxes of events, and only goes down just so deep as he finds a motive for doing, and therefore never reaches to the lowest foundation of the predominant general relations, his opinion will never have any value beyond the one case, and to him that which philosophy proves to be applicable to cases in general will only appear a dream. Without that general striving for rest and the maintenance of the existing condition of things, a number of civilised states could not live quietly side by side, they must necessarily become fused into one. Therefore, as Europe has existed in the present state for more than 1,000 years, we can only regard the fact as a result of the tendency of the collective interests. And if the protection afforded by the whole has not in every instance proved strong enough to preserve the independence of each individual state, such exceptions are to be regarded as irregularities in the life of the whole, which have not destroyed that life, but which have themselves been mastered by it. It would be superfluous to go over the mass of events in which changes which would have disturbed the balance too much have been prevented or reversed by the opposition more or less openly declared of other states. They will be seen by the most cursory glance at history. We only wish to say a few words about a case which is always on the lips of those who ridicule the idea of a political balance, and because it appears specially applicable here as a case in which an unoffending state, acting on the defensive, succumbed without receiving any foreign aid. We allude to Poland. That a state of 8 millions of inhabitants should disappear, should be divided amongst 3 others without a sword being drawn by any of the rest of the European states, appears at first sight a fact which either proves conclusively the general inefficiency of the political balance, or at least shows that it is inefficient to a very great extent in some instances. That a state of such extent should disappear, a prey to others, and those already the most powerful (Russia and Austria), appears such a very extreme case, that it will be said, if an event of this description could not rouse the collective interests of all free states, then the efficient action which this collective interest should display for the benefit of individual states is imaginary. But we still maintain that a single case, however striking, does not negative the general truth, and we assert next that the downfall of Poland is also not so unaccountable as may at first sight appear. Was Poland really to be regarded as a European state, a homogeneous member of a community of nations in Europe? No. It was a Tartar state, which instead of being located, like the Tartars of the Crimea on the Black Sea, on the confines of the territory inhabited by the European community, had its habitation in the midst of that community on the Vistula. We neither desire by this to speak disrespectfully of the Poles, nor to justify the petition of their country, but only to look at things as they really are. For 100 years this country had ceased to play any independent part in European politics, and had been only an apple of discord for the others. It was impossible that for a continuance it could maintain itself amongst the others with its state and constitution unaltered. An essential alteration in its Tartar nature would have been the work of not less than half, perhaps a whole century, supposing the chief men of that nation had been in favour of it. But those men were far too thorough Tartars to wish any such change. Their turbulent political condition and their unbounded levity went hand in hand. So they tumbled into the abyss. Long before the partition of Poland, the Russians had become quite at home there. The idea of its being an independent state with boundaries of its own had ceased, and nothing is more certain than that Poland, if it had not been partitioned, must have become a Russian province. If this had not been so, and if Poland had been a state capable of making a defence, the 3 powers would not so readily have proceeded to its partition, and those powers most interested in maintaining its integrity, like France, Sweden and Turkey, would have been able to co-operate in a very different manner towards its preservation. But if the maintenance of a state is entirely dependent on external support, then certainly too much is asked. The partition of Poland had been talked of frequently for 100 years, and for that time the country had been not like a private house, but like a public road, on which foreign armies were constantly jostling one another. Was it the business of other states to put a stop to this? Were they constantly to keep the sword drawn to preserve the political inviolability of the Polish frontier? That would have been to demand a moral impossibility. Poland was at this time politically little better off than an uninhabited steppe, and as it is impossible that defenceless steppes lying in the midst of other countries should be guarded for ever from invasion, therefore it was impossible to preserve the integrity of this state, as it was called. For all these reasons, there is as little to cause wonder in the noiseless downfall of Poland as in the silent conquest of the Crimean Tartars. The Turks had a greater interest in upholding the latter than any European state had in preserving the independence of Poland, but they saw that it would be a vain effort to try and protect a defenceless steppe. We return to our subject, and think we have proved that the defensive in general may count more on foreign aid than the offensive. He may reckon the more certainly on it in proportion as his existence is of importance to others, that is to say, the sounder and more vigorous his political and military condition. Of course, the subjects which have been here enumerated, as means properly belonging to the defensive, will not be at the command of each particular defensive. Sometimes one, sometimes another may be wanting, but they all belong to the idea of the defensive as a whole. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Mutual action and reaction of attack and defence. We shall now consider attack and defence separately, as far as they can be separated from each other. We commence with the defensive for the following reasons. It is certainly very natural and necessary to base the rules for the defence upon those of the offensive, and vice versa. But one of the two must still have a third point of departure, if the whole chain of ideas is to have a beginning, that is, to be possible. The first question concerns this point. If we reflect upon the commencement of war philosophically, the conception of war properly does not originate from the offensive, as that form has for its absolute object not so much fighting as the taking possession of something. The idea of war arises first by the defensive, for that form has the battle for its direct object, as warding off and fighting plainly are one and the same. The warding off is directed entirely against the attack, therefore supposes it necessarily, but the attack is not directed against the warding off, it is directed upon something else, the taking possession, consequently does not presuppose the warding off. It lies therefore in the nature of things that the party who first brings the element of war into action, the party from whose point of view two opposite parties are first conceived, also establishes the first laws of war, and that party is the defender. We are not speaking of any individual case, we are only dealing with a general and abstract case, which theory imagines in order to determine the course it is to take. By this we now know where to look for this fixed point, outside and independent of the reciprocal effect of attack and defence, and that is in the defensive. If this is a logical consequence, the defensive must have motives of action, even when as yet he knows nothing of the intentions of the offensive, and these motives of action must determine the organisation of the means of fighting. On the other hand, as long as the offensive knows nothing of the plans of his adversary, there are no motives for action for him, no grounds for the application of his military means. He can do nothing more than take these means along with him, that is, take possession by means of his army. And thus it is, also in point of fact, for to carry about the apparatus of war is not to use it, and the offensive who takes such things with him, on the quite general supposition that he may require to use them, and who, instead of taking possession of a country by official functionaries and proclamations, does so with an army, has not as yet committed, properly speaking, any act of warfare. But the defensive, who both collects his apparatus of war and disposes of it with a view to fighting, is the first to exercise an act which really accords with the conception of war. The second question is now, what is theoretically the nature of the motives which must arise in the mind of the defensive first, before the attack itself is thought of? Plainly, the advance made with a view to taking possession, which we have imagined extraneous to the war, but which is the foundation of the opening chapter. The defence is to oppose this advance. Therefore, in idea, we must connect this advance with the land, country, and thus arise the first most general measures of the defensive. When these are once established, then upon them the application of the offensive is founded, and from a consideration of the means which the offensive then applies, new principles again of defence are derived. Now here is the reciprocal effect which theory can follow in its inquiry, as long as it finds the fresh results which are produced are worth examination. This little analysis was necessary in order to give more clearness and stability to what follows, such as it is. It is not made for the field of battle, neither is it for the generals of the future. It is only for the army of theorists, who have made a great deal too light of the subject hitherto. End of chapter 7. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.